Hey everyone, Shaun Stevenson here, author of the Throne series, and I'm super excited because two of my different kinds of fandoms have now crossed over into each other, and I love it. What fandoms am I talking about? I'm talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine and spooky stories. Oh, I am so excited to talk about this book. This is book number 1 in the Star Trek Deep Space Nine series for middle grade readers called The Star Ghost by Brad Strickland. So, like I said, this is a middle grade book. So it's, it's like 120, 130 pages, right in that range. And this is based on the Star Trek Deep Space Nine television show featuring all the characters from that show. Now, I feel like I got to talk about the show for a second because right off the bat, I don't know if a person could read this book without having watched any of the show. I think if you haven't watched any of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, you are gonna be lost because unfortunately, so last year I actually decided to watch through all of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, like the entire series. So I did, episode to episode. There are some really great episodes, and there are some really bad episodes that annoyed me to no get out. But I am a huge Star Trek fan. This is my most nerdy nerddom of all time, but when the Star Trek Voyager series finale was about to air on television, my friend's aunt actually got tickets off of a radio contest to go see it at an IMAX theater before it aired on television. And it was the series finale, and I got to go. And it is still one of my most Star Trek-y moments of all time. I vividly remember people were dressed up as all the characters in these amazing cosplay costumes. It was incredible. I loved it. It was like one of my favorite experiences I've ever had. So that was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed this book. But like I said, I don't know if you can really enjoy this book without having watched any of the television show. Now, I don't think you need to have watched the entire series, but I think you need to have watched probably like 5 to 10 episodes so you have like a gist of what's happening in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, because it's very different than like the Jean-Luc Picard, like Star Trek, Next Generation show where they're just exploring space in the Enterprise. Like, that's a very easy concept, I think, to sell readers on, because you don't have to know a ton more than that. Like, each of those characters in Next Generation have backstory and lore and all those kinds of things. But Star Trek Deep Space Nine was a very different series. It was the first series that was stationary, so to speak, because it takes place on a space station. And the space station, there's a lot of like politics and religious stuff going on, and like a lot of war and so many things like that are happening in the background. And I just kept thinking, I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't watched the show. And I wouldn't have understood that if I hadn't watched the show. So I kind of think that limits this book series in quite a large way, because like I said, if you haven't seen the show, you're going to be probably pretty lost. So I'm going to do my best to explain. If you've never seen Star Trek Deep Space Nine and you're wondering, what is all of this? I'll do my best to explain it. I will do my best. So Star Trek Deep Space Nine is a space station. Deep Space Nine is a space station by this planet called Bajor. And Bajor is nearby this wormhole to another part of the galaxy. So this wormhole is highly sought after by a lot of different alien species, including a species called the Cardassians. And the Cardassians used to be like the overlords of Bajor before it was freed by Bajor freedom fighters. And then the Federation, which is where the Star Trek characters come together with the planet Bajor to run Deep Space Nine, which was previously a Cardassian space station. The Cardassians had built it, they had used it for enslavement, and it was a terrible place, but they're now redeeming this whole space station by having commerce happen there, having, interplanetary negotiations take place on the station, all these sorts of things. So the Cardassians, what's interesting about them is they are a villain kind of alien species in the world of Star Trek, but Not always. And sometimes they are very like helpful in a lot of different situations. So they kind of are like this anti-hero a lot of times in the world of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Okay, that's the basic setup here. So we have in this book, there are these two main characters, Jake and Nog. Jake is a human and Nog is what's called a Ferengi, and they are friends, which humans and Ferengi are usually not friends, but Jake and Nog are. And I think this was so smart of this middle grade book series to make them the main characters of this series, because they, when the show starts, are around 12, 13 years old, and by the time the show ends, they're adults. So I think this was a genius move to have them be the main characters of this series, because they're like middle graders. So it like creates this great bridge, in my opinion, for middle grade readers at the time who maybe like the show, but also want a book series, and here's the book series. In this particular book, Jake and Nog are hanging out when all of a sudden they see this girl drawing what looks like a ghost. And Nog recognizes this as a Ferengi ancestral spirit that haunts Ferengi. And Jake is wondering what's going on with this. Well, the ghost starts showing up around the space station, and the question is, what does the ghost want? What is the ghost up to? And is the ghost friendly? Or is the ghost evil? Either way, the ghost has a deadly message for the space station. And that's pretty much the setup of this book. This is one of my favorite kinds of Star Trek books, or well, Star Trek stories, because I love when Star Trek stories have a mystery to solve, when there's a little bit of like science-y stuff we got to do to solve that mystery, when we're trying to figure it out and piece it together and there's a solution somewhere, but if we just keep persevering and going for it, we'll find the solution. Those are my favorite kinds of Star Trek books, and this is one of them. This also has so much suspense. It is creepy. There were some creepy moments, and I just loved, because Star Trek sometimes can have what they kind of call the horror episodes, where there's like some really spooky stuff going on. There are episodes like that, and this would fit in one of those because it is so fun. This is just a fun Star Trek story. It's not based on any episode of the show, which I really also liked, that it was not based on an episode. It was its own story, but it also was so intense. This has huge stakes in this book. So huge stakes. And I loved that. I loved the twists and turns. I loved the spookiness. I loved the characters. It was really fun because in a lot of ways, this book, while it followed Jake and Nog as the main characters, it kind of played like a Disney Channel, show where all of a sudden guest star appears and everyone's cheering like, woo! That's kind of how it played with like characters from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the show. Like the adults show up in a chapter and we're interacting with them and you're like, oh, it's so and so. Oh, that's so great. So especially, that's where I think too, if you've seen the show, you will have all that like story lore knowledge that you wouldn't have otherwise. So I thought that was also really well done. I loved it. It kind of reminded me of, this book really reminded me of the Star Trek equivalent of the Star Wars Galaxy of Fear books, where like a main kind of Star Wars character shows up in those books at some point. This was very, very similar to that, where you had the Star Trek characters showing up, but it really follows these two characters. So it was just so much fun. I really enjoyed this book. I flew through it because I couldn't stop reading. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. It just was so much fun. So at the end of the day, I give the Star Ghost 5 out of 5 stars. This was so fun. I will admit it could be like my Star Trek fandom talking a tiny bit here, so take that with a grain of salt, But also, like I said, this was just a really fun, creepy story. I think if you want to read this series, because it looks like some of the other books also have some creepiness. There are, from what I can tell, 12 books in the series, and this is book number 1. I don't know if they build on each other yet. Star Trek usually doesn't really build on itself that much. It's usually kind of standalone stories within the universe. However, Star Trek Deep Space Nine did start to kind of play with that because they introduced continuing lore because they were on a space station where you kind of had the same characters showing up again and again, and you also had situations where things evolve in the interplanetary relationships. So there's a lot going on there. So I'm not sure if this series is going to connect that way or not. I'll have to read book 2, which I'm excited to read. But this was a fun book to read. I think so. Like I said, if you want to read this, but you've never seen Star Trek Deep Space Nine, I would say go watch like the pilot episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and maybe like go look for a list of some of the best episodes of seasons 1 and 2, because that I think will give you a good flavor for the show. Watch like at least like 5 episodes, and then I think you could dive into this and you would be like, oh yeah, it's so and so. Oh, it's that person. Oh, there's that person. And it would all kind of make sense. So otherwise you could dive into it without knowing anything about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, but just know that it probably won't be quite as enjoyable as if you've seen at least some of the show. If you're a fan of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, don't sleep on this. Go get this book. Read it. You're going to love it. It was from the 90s. It's so much fun. Get the book if you are a Star Trek fan. Anyways, that's all for now. So until next time, everybody, keep reading. Bye. And yes, I did wear my red shirt for this review. You're welcome, Star Trek fans.